Hello, I'm the director for our New Zealand not-for-profit charitable educational trust called Common Knowledge, and I founded the trust in the mid-1990s from the work that I had done in the United States with hundreds of fathers and mothers who developed the birthing better skills that our trust holds. And they also developed a concept, and that concept is that it should be normal and natural when pregnant to self-learn birth and birth coaching skills, then use those skills as you work through the activity of birthing your baby. No matter where birth occurs, no matter who's present, no matter beliefs or circumstances or choices, lack of choices, change of choices, or what happens at the birth, that giving birth is an activity 100% of pregnant women will do. And if there's somebody going to be at the birth with the woman other than the birth providers, that person should be skilled. Now, this is an ongoing series because there's lots of topics. And I don't have a lot of political passion around childbirth. I never did. The two areas that I have a particular passion for, however, in that field, is one is that all of us as pregnant women should become skilled, because I was privileged in 1970 to be part of the first generation of families, pregnant families, that had access to childbirth preparation. And we didn't have any choices back then, but Lamaze and Bradley method started to be taught everywhere. So we attended classes, my husband and myself, and we practiced the skills in between the classes. And then at the birth of our child in 1970, he had skills to help me cope and manage better. So my two political, I don't know whether political or personal passions, is for all pregnant families to become skilled, and the role of the other, most often the father, sometimes the mother or the sister or a friend, not the doula, not the childbirth educator, not the midwife, not the obstetrician, labor and delivery nurses, but the other person in this woman's life. They need to become skilled. And I have a really raging passion about that, because it was really clear before the first childbirth preparation classes in the 60s and the 70s was that women didn't have anything. So we were just culturally or locally, right, trying to get through birth. And there's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. So it just happened to us. We couldn't plan it. Didn't have any control over it. And primarily women suffered in childbirth. Some women didn't. Some women find birth easy and enjoyable. But for the majority of women, we really find it challenging, because you never know whether that painful contraction you're having now is going to continue to be a painful contraction for the next hour, 3 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. So you need to remember that until Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed in New Zealand, there were really no skills attached to birth at all. And don't believe anybody who says to you that we all knew about birth because we watched birth. That isn't accurate in most cultures traditionally. And how do I know? Because I worked in a lot of traditional communities not involved in birth, but you ask questions and you know that either that culture, fathers were involved or others were involved, or they weren't. So you need to understand that the role of the father in childbirth has really been kind of vague. And now it's become defined as a birth support. So I want to sort of catch you up to this. And if you're a man listening to this, you need to understand that primarily you're a human being. Right? You are a human being. I'm a human being. You're a human being. You blink, I blink. You cough, I cough. You can tighten up your rectum. I can tighten up my rectum. Here's another thing, guys. You have been inside a woman's body. No, I'm not talking about sex. Woman carried you in her body and she birthed you. Men are hardwired to understand birth. No woman has ever been inside a man's body. Women do not understand men as well as men understand women, because all men were carried and birthed inside a woman's body. So all men understand all of the hidden thoughts that women have. Men understand women incredibly well. Women have difficulty understanding men because we didn't organically ever grow inside or get birthed out of a man's body. So throughout history, as I say in the description, there are cultures where women went off by themselves. Now, every culture around the world, except for modern cultures, had a particular role for fathers, and that role was honored culturally. So in some cultures, women went off by themselves. In some cultures, when a woman went off to birth by themselves, that man had a very hard task that he had to do to show the woman that he was equally working as hard. In other cultures, women went off with women family members and disappeared sometimes for months at a time. So men were not involved in birth, nor were children. Other cultures, women birthed where they lived, and then anybody who was in that space of where they lived was at a birth. Children, the father, other people, didn't matter. And in sort of modern, industrial, Western-oriented society, fathers sometimes were involved in home births throughout time, and sometimes it was considered to be women's business. Once women started to go into the hospital, fathers were not permitted into the hospital. Nobody was permitted into the hospital other than the women. So women labored on their own. And then something changed. After the Second World War, we started to develop a different nuance in modern societies. And women who had been left alone to birth wanted husbands to be with them. Both Lamaze and Bradley, that were the first ever childbirth preparation classes, focused their attention on both the mother and the father. Bradley was called Husband Coach Childbirth or Father Coach Childbirth. That's a clue. Okay, so the expectation that we had as women was we wanted our husbands to be with us, and then that became expanded into family members or friends by the middle of the 80s, and we wanted them to help us cope and manage. We didn't want to suffer in childbirth anymore. We didn't want to be left alone. We didn't want to discover birth by ourselves because most of us found labor very, very, very painful. So fathers and mothers, we went to classes, we learned the first skills. Yes, many of them were very superficial skills, but we at least tried to work together. And I'll always be grateful for my now ex-husband for having taken time in his life to do that. Because he had a different feeling towards our child because he had been present through the hard work, it's called labor, and had been present at the birth. And so therefore, as a human being, and as a man, and as a partner, and as a father, being skilled through that process matured him so that his parenting was much more sophisticated and much more engaged and involved than if he hadn't been at the birth and I had arrived home with a baby and then I had started to take care of the baby. And this human being who was a man, and who was a partner for so many men because they weren't at birth, they didn't know how to handle newborn babies. And women had an obligation to take care of a kid. So they pushed this other human being who was a man, who was the father, who was their husband, away from the baby. And no wonder we feel men were disengaged from birth. Once men started to come into birth, they became more engaged for a period of time. And this is where my passion just starts screaming out of me. Because from the 60s to the 70s, fathers were called birth coaches, which meant that the expectation of them was that they help us to cope and manage, to work through, to handle, to deal with, to stay on top of, and feel in control during the natural occurring pain of labor contractions. Because in 1970, cesareans were major abdominal surgery done to save a woman's life, and all of us labored, whether we had risks or not, whether the risks became problems and tragedies, whether we labored for days or hours, whether we suffered, whether we enjoyed birth, whether we were left with trauma or not. The medical profession just wasn't sophisticated as it is today. And modern women weren't as demanding of risk reduction then as they were now, because risks were considered to be a normal part of life, as they are in societies where there's no medical care. But fathers then became significant, which meant from the 60s to the mid-70s, the labor and delivery nurses in the U.S. and obstetricians saw multiple millions of families using skills to work through the activity of birthing their baby. And this changed them. Except, and this is what I've tried to explain in everything, is Lamaze and Bradley and Grantley Dick Reed in New Zealand. They were obstetricians who were focused on low-risk women to learn skills to have a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions. They made the mistake of not just saying 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, 100% of pregnant women, when they give birth, are doing the activity with their baby, 100% of pregnant women should have skills to do this activity, because suffering was the much bigger issue around childbirth and always has been, instead of risks. Many people have risks. Some risks become problems. Some problems become tragedies. But it's an infinitely smaller group. It's not like you have risks and you have a bigger number of problems and a bigger number of tragedies. It's the reverse. You have lots of risks. Many of those risks never become problems. So the number of problems from risks are narrowed down, and the number of tragedies from problems are even smaller. But the number of women who suffered in childbirth is massively big. So if we had, back in the 60s and 70s, just said skills are for everybody so that we don't suffer, we would not be in this conversation now, and fathers would have a clearer role. So when I gave birth in the 70s, fathers were given these minimal skills, but they were tied to a low-risk birth. They were tied to having a pain-free labor. So how do you feel when you're using skills and you're feeling pain? You stop using them because they don't work, right? So Lamaze and Bradley skills didn't really work for many people. When we developed birthing better skills, damn it, we wanted them to work, and we wanted them to work for all of us. So fathers and mothers developed these skills equally. Based on what? We didn't share religion, we didn't share languages, we didn't share race, we didn't share viewpoints, we didn't share circumstances around our pregnancy or birth. We all blinked. We all coughed. We could all tighten up our rectum. And childbirth, if nothing else, is the epitome of a physiological experience for women. It's a big object that has to get out of a container. So fathers see birth from the outside. We do it from the inside. And they see things we don't see. So they were as instrumental in creating these skills as we as women were. So we wanted better skills than we were getting from Lamaze and Bradley. And so we developed them. And we developed them over a 15-year period, first to just stop suffering, which we did. And even though people didn't necessarily use birthing better, Lamaze and Bradley just cut down the suffering because women and men had some skills to try to work together. And some skills are better than none skills. So even if you are due tomorrow, it is better to learn one skill and use it than to go in and go too late. It's not too late. This is your baby's birth. So what happened after I gave birth and before I gave birth, my last birth in 1982, was the whole childbirth trend changed. The natural birth movement became very strong, very global. They dismissed skills because they didn't work to achieve those three narrow goals of a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical interventions for low-risk women or women who were choosing to try to do that. So they dismissed skills, and they fell back on truth, that was perceived of inaccurately. Uh, Only women get pregnant, only women give birth. But just because we get pregnant doesn't mean we know how to birth. So the natural birth statement is women have always given birth and they know how. Cats and cows aren't taught to give birth. Women don't need to be taught to give birth. That is such an inaccurate perception. And it's inaccurate. We know that, right? Some women have great births. And yes, I've talked to tens and thousands of women over 50 years. I've had women say to me who have had a great birth, it just flowed. I just had this wonderful birth. I just seemed to know what to do. And you just want to praise them, hug them, and congratulate them for that. And honestly, women who have those kind of births have no idea why other women don't. And that's the same way. Women have terrible births, don't know why women have good births. And caught in the middle of all of this is the other, or the birth coach. When you were a birth coach in the 60s and the 70s, you had clear skills. You went in and tried to use them as best as possible, mostly in the hospital, in and around all of the medical assessments, the monitoring and procedures. The staff and the obstetrician just let you get on with it. And the woman relied on you to help her cope and manage better. That was a good role. Your baby is already here when you're pregnant. Your baby is here during the birth. As a human being, as a man, as a father, and as a partner, you want to be skilled because after the baby's born, you want to feel comfortable with this baby, not alienated from this other human being that you created. So you want to be skilled. So between 1970 and 82, the natural birth movement moved fathers out of that role. They moved women out of the role of having skills. They moved everybody into birth plans and choices. And that has been an absolute tragedy in childbirth. The first tragedy was that the obstetricians didn't include 100% of pregnant women. The second tragedy was for narrow goals of a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical care rather than not suffering. The next tragedy was to believe that women didn't need to be taught to birth. And the next tragedy was say to fathers, no, you shouldn't be helping a woman cope. You should just be supporting her choices. And so fathers now have no clue what to do. And women know they have no clue. And the meteoric rise of shame, blame, guilt, disappointment, anger, frustration, and emotional birth trauma has just been phenomenal since the 80s. And what's sad for me is that we tried to stop it. We're a tiny little voice in a massive global movement. And we saw the change from multiple millions of families in the United States from the 60s to the mid-70s who dignified birth by being skilled to now nobody's skilled. Nobody sees skilled women. They see a few women who cope well and a few women who have these absolutely gorgeous births who, if you ask them, they will say to you, I've focused on my breathing, I've focused on relaxing. They are using skills. They just don't know how to articulate that to someone else or to pass those skills on or even to share those skills with the baby's father or the other person who's there. And that's a shame. And that's why we need to grow a skilled birthing population where it's natural and normal that when you're pregnant that you learn birth and birth coaching skills and use those skills no matter how your birth unfolds. It's important. So what happens when a father becomes a support person? Well, he doesn't really know anything. A woman can have a list, sort of like a wedding. Here's a list of things I want. How many men are really involved in the wedding? Yeah, they approve of it, they don't approve of it, but it's not really on their minds. The birth of their baby is more in their minds because it's changing their life. But the reality is fathers are still very confused because they don't know whether birth is women's business. They are not being taught how to coach, and they're being told to support women's choices. And in the years since birth plans have been around, I cannot tell you how many thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people say, my birth didn't go to plan. No kidding. And how many men have said, she didn't want this or that, and then during the birth she begged for it. And I just went, okay, she knows. And then after the birth, 6 months or 18 months later, the woman's mad at the man for not supporting what she put originally in her birth plan and then changed her mind about. So men cannot support women's choices. Men do not know what women are really choosing in childbirth. If a woman sits there and says, well, I don't want to be induced, a man can go, okay, what's that mean? And then she goes past 42 weeks, or the baby starts to look like it's having a problem. And this is a man who is sitting there thinking about the woman, why, just go get induced, for fuck's sake, right? And the woman's going, no, I don't want to be induced. And he's going, what are you talking about? He doesn't know how to support her choice, and she doesn't know how to support her own choice. Because if she doesn't get induced and there's a problem, she's pissed off. And if she does get induced and there's a problem, she's pissed off. We do not know what our birth's going to be like. Babies don't come to plan. There's no way to know what your birth's going to be like. Making choices is much more about your moment-to-moment behaviors, how you cope and manage. And this is where fathers or others excel, because they see and hear you, right? Simple as that. So if I'm sounding like this, let's say I'm laboring, even if it's painful, that's not sex, okay? A man can sit there and he can see and hear. And that's different than hearing this, or seeing that. He can see the difference. We as women can't always hear the difference, and we don't always know what our face is doing. So he can see and hear. And if he can see and hear the change between what sounds okay, he doesn't know what you're thinking, and what obviously sounds like you're having a moment of not coping, he can, with skill, step in and help right away. And that's what birthing better skills are all about, is our ability to have this communication as human beings on these two different roles, not based on gender, on the two different roles. We birth, and sometimes I'm the other, okay? And it's really, really important. Now, if you're a solo mom, I want to tell you, many, many birthing better families were solo mom. I was one. So if I needed to in birth, I would just quickly teach somebody there to help me use a skill so I would cope. It's very important. If skills are universal, then they should be easy to teach, and you should be easy to be able to do that. So it's really important that fathers and others know how to help. What happened was that fathers were removed from the role of being a birth coach, and doulas were put in that space. And that's not fair to doulas. It's not right for the families. Am I against doulas? No. Personally, I think that they should all be doing postpartum stuff, and that we need to change the childbirth message. And we know what childbirth message we need to change. Fathers should not be a support person. They should be a birth coach. That's a change in message. Okay? The idea is that a father or other, someone else is going to be in that baby's life, if they're going to be at the birth, should have the skills to help the woman cope and manage, because they're going to be in that child's life. And that woman wants the other person to be able to know how to parent or grandparent or be a good friend and be in that child's life. It's not like, how do you explain this? If you're at a birth and you don't know how to help, then you have an assumption that in parenting you don't help. That's a natural assumption. But if you're at a birth and you have to help, because that's your role as a birth coach to help, then your assumption is that once the baby is born, because the baby's still here, that you're going to help once the baby's born. It's a natural assumption. So this is why we need to have strong, capable, skilled birth coaches. Honestly, you just need to do this. Now, at the end of all of these talks, my role is to change the message in childbirth. Okay, so the message in childbirth now, you pretty much know. which is you should make a birth plan. You know what your birth's going to be like. You hope that they're going to give you the birth that you want. And birth is the most natural thing in the world. And it's ideal to have a natural birth and not have any interventions. And when you get more picky, you should be having a birth at home, and you should be having it in water, and you should be having it with a midwife. And that's basically the message. And you should do your research about your pros and cons of medical interventions that are, of course, imposed on you and unnecessary. That's the basic message that's been around since the 80s. Okay, it's not working. It wasn't going to work then. It isn't going to work now. You cannot change things by doing the same thing over and over again. That is the definition of insanity. So if we're going to change it, we have to have another idea. And the other idea was already there. The other idea has been there forever, which is 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. It's always been there. And that it's an activity that each of us does with our baby. No woman can get out of doing it. She can't break for lunch. She can't give it to someone else. We have to do the activity of giving birth. If we fell pregnant, we will give birth. Whether that is a termination, whether that is a miscarriage, whether it is a cesarean, we are giving birth. It's an activity. It takes time. Every activity humans do are best done with skills. We need to infuse birth, this infrequent activity that is so life-transforming and is never forgotten. We need to infuse it with skills. So you need to start to tell people, 100% of pregnant women will give birth. We're all going to do that activity. We'd feel better with skills. So it's normal and natural in pregnancy to learn skills. That makes common sense. And then use the skills during the activity. That makes common sense. And if you're a woman and you're going to have anybody else with you at all that you know and love and is going to be in that family's life, all of you learn skills so you can all work together. You're going to work together once the baby's born. For goodness sake, learn skills now. That's the new message. Okay? That's the new message. It just should be normal and natural, self-learned birth skills, and use the skills when you birth your baby. Whoever there, the woman and whoever else is there. The birth professionals have their own set of skills. Your job first is to help women not suffer. If those skills can help women birth more effectively so that issues don't become problems and problems don't become tragedies, yay, that's an add-on. Okay? And about supporting a woman's choices. Honestly, do we think you should make birth plans? Yeah, if it makes you feel better. But if you're going to spend 6 hours in pregnancy to learn about the pros and cons, at least spend 6 hours learning skills. Because at your birth, for instance, if you chose not to be induced, if you got induced, it took 10 seconds, maybe 15. But you still have to do the activity. So if the skills are what you're going to use or what you're going to do, right? The medical assessments, monitor, and procedures come with the territory. Whether you're at home with a midwife, she's got standards of care. Whether you're in the hospital, the hospital has standards of care, and the birth professionals have standards of care. If you don't want any of those things, don't birth with anybody but yourselves and never go see a doctor. But most of us are going to birth within some system or some variations of systems. Use your skills and work together as a family. It's so important. So if you're a birth professional, you now have the responsibility to change the message in childbirth, because there's not going to be a rising up of women. There never really was a rising up of women around childbirth. There was a rising up of a small group of women who got together, got very verbal, and made wonderful changes in childbirth and left a trail of disaster as well, because they got fixed on an ideology that pregnancy and childbirth are normal life events that rarely require medical care, and that statement is just full of inaccuracies. People have health issues before they get pregnant. Pregnancy can exacerbate them, or they get rid of them, or they get new ones, or the baby has some. Birth is even a more time frame of that. Medical care is available in modern societies. It's not available in other societies. People use medical care. They use assessments, monitoring procedures to try to reduce the risks. So we are not going to all go bush again to birth, but we can all become skilled to do this. And we can all have a skilled other helping us to do this. So as a birth professional, you know all this. You know birth plans don't work. You know it's nice to tell people to make a birth plan, and you basically can chuck it over your shoulder because you know most of them don't unfold the way that women want, no matter how hard you try to give it to them. So this is what you need to say as a birth professional, whether you're an obstetrician, whether you're a nurse midwife, a direct entry midwife, a doula, a childbirth educator, or anybody else involved with pregnant women. You just simply need to say to people, 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth, and it's an activity you are going to do with your baby. So it's natural and normal for you to learn some skills and then use the skills as the activity unfolds. That's simple. If you happen to have a handout of different skills-based methods, plunk it in their lap and say, please choose, or say, go online and look for skills. Choices and information is different. Focus on skills, what you're going to do. Then, please, if you are a primary birth provider, seeing women regularly, put in their notes from 24 weeks and tell people, 24 weeks, we're going to start to collect your skills. I don't need to know them. You need to know them. You learn breathing. You learn relaxation at 28 weeks. You learn teamwork at 32 weeks or something else. Just put the skills in the notes, because at the birth, if the birth unfolds as the woman wants, yay, lucky her. If it unfolds nothing like she imagined, which is the majority of us, and she looks like she's coping and her other looks like they're helping, praise them. You want to work with skilled families. It makes your job easier. And if they look overwhelmed, look in their notes, or anybody can look in their notes and see, well, you learned relaxation. Well, I said, but I didn't. Well, okay, that's what you have. But if you did, well, I didn't think I should be doing it because my birth isn't what I want. No, it's your baby's birth. You got pregnant to have a baby, not a type of birth. Work through your baby's birth. Encourage people to use skills. Stop. No, my passion is just going to roll out of my mouth today. Birth professionals don't care. And I have to tell you this. When we were all going in with Lamaze or Bradley skills, labor and delivery nurses and obstetricians basically didn't care. Well, first of all, they were being told those skills were being used to have a natural birth, pain-free labor with no medical intervention. So they couldn't see the forest for the trees that less of us suffered, because that was the message being driven and not the reduced suffering. But they had ways to help us if we didn't cope, which was called pain relief. So if we came in and were skilled, they were delighted to work with us, but that wasn't what they were trained to do, so they didn't give us any message. They didn't care. It's not a negative. It's just not their job, right? So midwives cared less, and they cared less based on ideology. And the ideology was that women know how to birth and should be left alone to discover birth by themselves. So the midwifery model does not care if you have skills. And not only that, but they can't tell whether you're suffering or not. They just let you go on and on and on and on and on because they think that's normal and natural, right? And this is where childbirth conversation has become confusing. And for fathers who are going to be at the birth, this is what you're faced with. The labor and delivery or the staff midwives do not care. They love working with skilled families, but they don't care. Nor does the obstetrician. If you're working with a midwife at home, she does not care. So you as a birth coach, you need to care. You need to care that this woman who you care about, this child you care about, if you can help her reduce the suffering, she will love you forever, be grateful forever, because the staff in the hospital, the obstetrician, and the midwife, even home birth midwives, they're not going to be in your lives. And so you need to care. And you need to care to help her. And to care to help her means you need to take some time to learn skills. Preferably start around 24 weeks and learn skills little by little by little. Birthing better skills were developed equally by fathers. We know there are other skills-based methods. Bradley was father's coach childbirth. That's another great one. Lamaze was sort of. Things like hypnobirthing, kind of, sort of, gentle birth, hypnobabies, calm birth, not so much. Fathers are not as involved. So you need to look into childbirth skills-based courses and pick courses that give you realistic skills. Because here's the bottom line of this, and this is why I'm so bloody passionate about it. If just accidents happen, right? Let's say your partner's medically high risk. You're terrified. She's had a cesarean. Your baby was a medical high risk. The cesarean saved your baby's life. And now she wants a VBAC, and you're terrified. You're absolutely horrified. Everything sets you up for being terrified about this birth. Just imagine this scenario. Okay? One scenario is that you guys didn't learn skills. The other scenario is you did learn skills. Can't necessarily reduce the fear. Skills learned, skills not learned. So let's say that whole scenario is at play. You get in the car to go to the hospital, and suddenly she starts to say, oh, baby's coming, baby's coming. Common sense. Skills, no skills. Which do you want? Okay. So let's go further. Kids at home, chokes on something. Do you want skills or no skills? Of course you want skills. Why should you not want skills to help this woman do the activity of birthing your baby? We need to get grunt, and the grunt is become skilled. So I have ranted and raved at you. What's your job now listening to me? Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Share the Facebook posts that we're doing. Ask questions. Let us talk about this stuff. Let's change the conversation. You give the new conversation. It's normal and natural in pregnancy to learn self-learn birth and birth coaching skills and use them when you birth your baby. Simple message. And if you're a birth professional, change your message and add that as well. You'll never regret it if you're going to be with births, because we know birth professionals who have done that, and their whole profession has changed. Their own profession, their own clientele has changed. So do it. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.